Hello, I'm Dilek Tuna and you're watching A News. Let's take a look at today's top stories. Trump threatens to block opening of US-Canada bridge. Epstein's former girlfriend, Ghislaine Maxwell, refuses to answer questions at the US congressional hearing. And US Vice President J.D. Vance makes nuclear deal with Armenia and heads to Azerbaijan on tour of the South Caucasus. US President Donald Trump says Washington will start negotiations with Canada over a new bridge linking the two countries and has warned it may not open unless the United States gets what he calls a fair deal.
US President Donald Trump says Washington will begin immediate negotiations with Ottawa over the Gordie Howe International Bridge, a major new crossing between Ontario and Michigan. In a social media post, Trump warned he could block the bridge from opening unless the US is, in his words, fully compensated and treated with fairness and respect. The project is a key piece of transport infrastructure aimed at easing pressure on existing crossings and improving the flow of trade between the two countries. Canada has funded the project, which is expected to cost around roughly $4.7 billion US. Once operational, it will be publicly owned by Canada and the US state of Michigan. The bridge is expected to open in early 2026, pending final safety tests and approvals. Trump says the project unfairly favors Canada, arguing that US firms and materials played a limited role in its construction, while Canada stands to benefit heavily from American trade traffic. He has also linked the issue to wider trade disputes, including Canadian tariffs on US dairy products and Canada's recent trade engagement with China. It remains unclear whether the US president has the legal authority to block the bridge's opening.
World leaders and senior officials are gathering in Germany this week for the Munich Security Conference. A large US delegation led by Secretary of State Marco Rubio is expected to play a big role.
The Munich Security Conference opens this week from Friday to Sunday, bringing together world leaders, ministers, and senior security officials. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is expected to attend, with the war in Ukraine again high on the agenda. 15 European Union prime ministers and heads of state are due to attend, and Germany's chancellor will open the conference. Delegations are also expected from across the Middle East, Latin America, and Asia. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is expected to lead a large American delegation.
In my view, transatlantic relations are currently experiencing a significant crisis of confidence and credibility. That is why it is particularly gratifying that the American side is taking such a keen interest in Munich. I expect well over 50 members of the American Congress and an impressive delegation from the American government, led, according to the latest information, by Secretary of State Marco Rubio.
Rubio is expected to address the conference on Saturday, with organizers saying they anticipate a focus on U.S. foreign policy rather than domestic European issues. One of the central themes of the conference will be Europe's ability to act more decisively through its own capabilities and to speak with a single voice. Organizers point to Europe's recent response to U.S. pressure over Greenland and trade as an example of how the bloc can assert itself when required.
Ukraine and France have agreed to start joint weapons production, according to Ukraine's Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov. The news was announced on Monday after hosting his French counterpart, Catherine Vautrin, in Kyiv. The two countries signed a letter of intent, paving the way for large-scale joint projects in the defence industrial sector. He did not specify what arms would be produced or when manufacturing would be launched. NATO is expected to launch a new Arctic mission as the once remote region becomes a strategic focal point for global powers. The operation, known as Arctic Sentry, is aimed at reinforcing the alliance's presence and coordination in the High North. Anita Sharma has more.
Welcome to this day in Europe, with NATO poised to launch the strategic Arctic Sentry mission as the region transforms from a frozen backwater to a full-on obsession amid heightened interest from the U.S., Russia, and China. Arctic Sentry will reportedly focus on military exercises, increased surveillance, additional vessels and air assets in the region, including drones. However, some sources tell Reuters the focus will be on using NATO resources more effectively rather than adding large amounts of new forces. The overall goal of the mission, to reinforce NATO's presence in the Arctic, to reduce tensions between the U.S. and European NATO partners. Last week, NATO said it initiated plans after Secretary General Mark Rutte spoke with U.S. President Trump in Davos. And yesterday in Luxembourg, NATO's Supreme Allied Commander, U.S. Air Force General Alexis Grinkowicz said, quote, "If the brief goes well, we might have something that we can announce later this week." The alliance's defense ministers are meeting at the Brussels headquarters this Thursday, and this all follows last year's launch of Baltic Sentry to increase critical infrastructure security in the Baltic Sea, and Eastern Sentry to bolster military posture along the eastern flank. While Ukraine remains NATO's immediate priority, the Arctic Sentry mission signals that the alliance is preparing for a longer-term environment of global strategic competition. NATO hopes a permanent sentry posture will deter aggression while reassuring northern members such as Norway, Denmark, and Iceland, and of course the U.S., that their security concerns are being taken seriously. For A News, I'm Anita Sharma in Arnhem, Netherlands.
The Jeffrey Epstein files continues to create political and legal turbulence in both the United States and the United Kingdom. The late sex offender Epstein's associate Ghislaine Maxwell has refused to answer questions before the US House's committee, invoking her Fifth Amendment right. Meanwhile, in the UK, police say they're assessing allegations linked to former Prince Andrew.
The associate and former girlfriend of the late sex offender Jeffrey Epstein has drawn criticism from both Republican and Democratic members of the US House of Representatives Committee. It's after Ghislaine Maxwell refused to answer questions at a deposition before the House on Monday. Maxwell, who was found guilty in 2021 for her role in helping Epstein sexually abuse teenage girls, invoked her Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination.
I invoke my Fifth Amendment right to silence.
But her attorney, David Marcus, said that Maxwell is prepared to speak fully and honestly if granted clemency by President Donald Trump. Democrats on the committee accused Maxwell of using the deposition to campaign for clemency from the president and called on Trump to rule out such a move. Meanwhile, the Justice Department began allowing lawmakers to examine millions of unredacted documents from the Epstein files that haven't been released publicly.
It wasn't just Epstein and Maxwell, or showed up to the island, or showed up to the ranch, or showed up to the home knowing underage girls were being paraded around, and some of the sickening stuff in there about the violence. And what we want to do is have the investigation to get to those people to answer those questions.
Alongside the United States, the United Kingdom also has the Epstein files in the spotlight. Britain's Royal Palace said that it is prepared to assist police as they assess allegations regarding former Prince Andrew in connection with Epstein. Thames Valley Police confirmed that they are examining claims that Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, as he is now known, shared confidential documents with Epstein while serving as the UK's trade envoy. The former royal has consistently denied any wrongdoing.
Britain's Prince William, the Prince of Wales, met with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in the Saudi capital Riyadh on Monday during his first official visit to the kingdom. At the start of a 3-day visit, Saudi Crown Prince accompanied Prince William on a tour of the heritage site of Diriyah, considered the birthplace of the Saudi state. William is expected to hold an audience with the Crown Prince and take part in engagements focused on the kingdom's economic reforms, cultural initiatives and environmental programs. An Israeli airstrike in Gaza has killed at least 4 people. This comes in the middle of international condemnation over Israel's move to expand its authority in the West Bank.
At least 4 Palestinians have been killed and several others wounded after an Israeli airstrike hit a residential building in Gaza. The attack comes amid a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas that was signed in October last year. The Israeli army has yet to comment on the strike. Hamas accused Israel of escalating violations of the ceasefire by targeting civilian homes under what it described as false pretexts. Meanwhile, the United Nations joined Saudi Arabia, Jordan and the United Arab Emirates on Monday in condemning an Israeli move to ease settlement expansion and expand its authority in the West Bank. The measures would make it easier for Jewish settlers to purchase land in the West Bank and grant Israeli authorities greater powers in areas meant to be under full Palestinian control. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres expressed concern over the development, warning it could undermine prospects for a two-state solution.
I can tell you that the Secretary-General is gravely concerned by the reported decision of the Israeli Security Cabinet to authorize a series of administrative and enforcement measures in Area A and Area B of the occupied West Bank. The Secretary-General warns that the current trajectory on the ground, including this decision, is eroding the prospects for a two-state solution. He reiterates that all Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem and their associated regime and infrastructure, have no legal validity and are in flagrant violation of international law, including relevant United Nations resolutions.
Palestinians have also voiced alarm over the move, which has raised fears of annexation.
This government is a fascist government that wants to control all areas of the West Bank, areas A, B and C, and does not want a Palestinian presence in the West Bank or Gaza. They want to displace the Palestinian people, and they want the land to be without inhabitants.
In a joint statement, foreign ministers from several Middle Eastern and other Muslim-majority countries, including Egypt and Turkey, denounced the decisions as a violation of international law, saying they would impose unlawful Israeli sovereignty in the West Bank.
Demonstrations erupted in Sydney over the visit of Israeli President Isaac Herzog. Police action and mass arrests have now sparked political debate over crowd control and protest rights in the country.
Thousands of protesters gathered in central Sydney on Monday night opposing the visit of Israeli President Isaac Herzog. Clashes broke out between demonstrators and police, with officers using pepper spray and tear gas after groups of protesters attempted to push through security lines. Authorities says that 27 people were arrested during the confrontations. Authorities had declared Herzog's visit a major event, allowing police to use special powers. These included moving and separating crowds, restricting access to certain areas, ordering people to leave and searching vehicles. In a Sydney court on Monday, the Palestine Action Group, which organised the protest, failed to legally challenge the restrictions on the demonstration. New South Wales Premier Chris Minns defended the police response. He said officers were forced to make fast decisions in tense and volatile conditions and urged the public to remain calm.
I think it's important that people not judge the actions of police on 10 seconds or 15-second social media clips. That's not fair to the police's relationship with the protest organisers, the 100 protests that they've successfully and peacefully managed in Sydney CBD going back a long period of time. And it doesn't take into consideration the immediate situation prior to that confrontation.
President Herzog is visiting Australia this week at the invitation of Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. The visit follows a deadly shooting at a Hanukkah event in Sydney's Bondi Beach area last December.
The United States military says it carried out a strike on a vessel in the Eastern Pacific, killing 2 people and leaving 1 survivor. In a statement posted on social media on Monday, the military said the vessel was involved in narco-trafficking operations. The incident marks the latest development in the war on drugs, as US President Trump's administration has in recent weeks highlighted its successes in targeting suspected drug trafficking vessels. Airlines around the world are being warned to find alternative locations to refuel in the Caribbean region after a warning was issued by Cuba that it has no supplies for 4 weeks.
Due to restrictions placed on the island by US President Donald Trump, Cuban authorities have put out a notice to aviation statement warning airline companies of the issue. Although this is not the first time this situation has happened, the news has generated panic amongst travellers.
Urgent measures must be taken because people who are going to travel far away if there is no fuel, I don't know if their flights will be cancelled until there is another countermeasure. I don't know, something. They have to take some measure.
Reports say that most flights have been reported to have arrived on time into Jose Marti International Airport on Monday morning. However, for local residents, they have a nervous wait to see if people they are waiting for arrive on time.
I'm waiting for a relative here who is coming today. I can't tell you, you understand. But planes have taken off and landed. Look, there's one going now, another one from the United States. I can't tell you anything else.
Cuba announced a fuel rationing plan on Friday, and there aren't expected to be any issues.
After the break, we'll look ahead to the Munich Security Conference, where US leadership and global support for Ukraine will be in focus. Stay with us. Welcome back to A News. Officials say US Secretary of State Marco Rubio will lead the American delegation to this year's Munich Security Conference, where Volodymyr Zelensky is also expected to address global security leaders. To discuss, let's bring in our guest Nuno Wanon Martins, a political analyst, joining us from Lisbon, Portugal. Nuno, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Now, to start off with, what does the attendance of President Zelensky and US Secretary of State Rubio signal about US priorities, especially in the face of competing global crises?
Well, first and foremost, this is an European conference, and it's a priority for Europe, the war in Ukraine, and the support for Ukraine and for President Zelensky. So I think this is, it goes without saying that this is the first priority of the European Union and the European member states. Secondly, we are debating the most and the more challenging issue at the moment is the intervention of or the continuation of the so-called Pax Americana in the world, and especially the relationship between Europe and the US, and also the continuation of NATO as it is. It doesn't mean that, in my view, what Secretary of State Rubio is coming to say, it's going to be very interesting to listen. It's not going to be, in my view, the same as it was last year with Vice President J.D. Vance, but it's going to say the same thing. Pax Americana doesn't mean that the American taxpayers have to pay for everyone in the world just to secure peace in the world. It is important that Europe can develop itself into a more independent defense system, more capable defense system, and that doesn't mean that the relationship with the US can deteriorate directly. It means that we have to answer problems in the world. The American administration has a different view of the multilateral world, and of course this is one of the topics of the Munich Security Conference, is the disruption on that multilateral world. And the only way to do it is we need a stronger Europe. And I do think that this is basically what Secretary Rubio will say, in my view.
And does the US sending Rubio reflect any intentional shift in the diplomatic messaging compared to past years?
Of course, there is a different diplomatical message here. There is, I would say that the US administration wants to resolve problems in the world. They want to go into a different type of dynamics within global order. We have seen, because of the continuation of the multilateral world in the past 50 to 80 years old, the acceptance of certain countries leading with issues without solving those issues, either within those countries or between relations with certain countries. We saw that with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when Russia kept relations with Syria, with Venezuela, with Iran. And I do believe that the US administration is trying to solve those issues, and is trying to solve those issues in their own way, which is completely different than the typical diplomatic talks that we had in the past, which was basically the core of the multilateral world order. It doesn't mean that you don't need diplomacy. but you need diplomacy with a big stick, not with a small carrot. And in that sense, this is what Europe has to see and has to adapt as well. It is clear that the way the European Union and the European member states have been pushing for certain diplomatic goals, they were not successful. They have to be changed, they have to be adapted. And it's up to Europe to start that process rather than to have the Americans telling us to do it.
Okay, and as you said earlier, the priority for Europe here is the war on Ukraine, and Munich brings together NATO allies and global partners. How unified do you expect the messaging on Ukraine to be this year, and where might gaps appear?
We are talking about the Munich Security Conference. The meeting is in Munich. The position of the German government is very essential here. So the goal is going to be, and if you see this shift in the European structure, where now you have a strong bond between Italy and Germany, and both governments are very much supporting President Zelensky, I think it will be the continuation of trying to support Zelensky and the Ukrainian army, either with money for guns, either with trying, because we cannot produce guns to deliver directly to the Ukrainians. This will be, in my view, the main position. We will have the traditional division within the European Union member states, Hungary, Slovakia, and others, now with Czech Republic as well, or Czechia, also being less supportive of Ukraine. The question is, it is important that in the past 4 years, immediately after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, that the message was one, they cannot change the message 180 degrees suddenly. If the message is going to be changed, it's not going to be changed now. It is true that you have already some member states like France who want to start a dialogue. Also, Vice President Kallas of the European Commission said the same thing, the High Representative of the EAS. They want to start a communication with President Putin. That is a shift in the message, and that was said in the past 4 years. And it is important to see in this conference what it will be, in my view, the position of the European institutions. I do believe that President von der Leyen is going to keep on this line of supporting Ukraine. As I said before, Germany and Italy as well. I don't think that there will be the strongest member states who are, let's put it like this, the coalition of the willing will continue supporting Ukraine. You won't see much of disdain here in the conference, but I'm afraid that that message will be changing within the next year if the war doesn't end.
And Nuno Rubio has been vocal on deterrence and defence position. What specific policy shifts or new commitments could he realistically pursue in the conference, at the conference?
What, realistically speaking, the only thing that the European member states can do at this moment is to promise that and to fulfill that promise for themselves rather than to the United States of America, that they are going to develop and to increase, as they are already doing with the defense programs they have in the European Commission, in order to create a capability. But that capability is not going to be done within a certain time. It's not going to be fast. It's impossible. So the first promise here has to be the courage and the willing of starting the process as soon as possible in order to achieve it in the coming years, hopefully immediately after the end of the US Trump administration in 4 years. So this is one of the things that has to be promised by the Europeans. In my view, it's the only thing that is credible and feasible to be done, but more than that, it's almost unrealistic to say.
And you know, China and Russia won't be in the room, but their shadows will be. How does the demographic of attendees and the points they emphasise reflect broader geopolitical competition?
Well, that's with Europe. We have to see all of this into an European perspective. This is why I'm trying to focus and come back to the European Union and to the European Union member states. It is true that you have a decrease in population in Europe, and you don't necessarily have an increase in the Chinese population, despite the high volume of population in China. And in Russia, you have the same problem. So what is to be done? You have two different dialogues or opinions in Europe. You have people who want to make immigrants come to Europe. China has been doing that, but when China does that, it creates, in many countries where you saw that in the past, it raised tensions within the native populations with the Chinese communities. I'm not talking about the traditional old Chinese communities that have been living for centuries in Malaysia and other places, but I'm talking about recent cases in Africa, for instance, so this is important to be put on the table. It will be naive, in my view, for Europe to make the assumption that we need indefinitely immigrants to come to Europe to support what we say the welfare state. We need to adapt. Adaptation needs, or readaptation needs, to see and to value a lot of the principles that we have sustained in the past 50 years, more or less. And to do that, the population issue has to be seen. Some people say that whatever it was made in Europe to increase natality didn't work out. I'm not so sure about that, but policies have to be reseen, and we cannot see for granted that everything that was in the past can continue as it is today. So in that sense, we need to see if Russia and China, we cannot see Russia and China as partners on one hand and as enemies on the other hand. It doesn't go along. So the question is, how are we going to adapt ourselves to this reality? And again, like we spoke about defense, Europe has to talk about itself internally, has to adapt internally, and has to make a decision by its own in order to surpass this challenge.
Okay. And my last question to you, Nuno. Past conferences have produced statements of principle, but few binding actions. What measurable outcomes would real progress at Munich look like?
I think there is one point that we didn't discuss, which is the acceptation of AfD as participating in the conference. This makes it's crossing one line, which in my view is understandable, as once you accept a party in a democratic system, either you accept it or you don't accept it. You cannot play a double game. Either you like the ideology or not. This is the first thing. The second thing is these conferences, they have two means. The first mean is to deliver general goals for the next year and principles for the parties which are involved and the parties which matter. The Munich Security Conference is a European conference, but is mainly a German conference where the principles of the German defense community is shown as to be developed in the future. That's the first thing. The second thing is, what is important in this conference is the discussions being held behind the scenes and the dialogues being held behind the scenes. This is why you make these conferences as well. These are opportunities to gather actors and players who can discuss without going necessarily to a place to discuss on specific issues. Mm-hmm. So these two things will deliver a view. It is clear that today the conference has already, despite the fact that Ambassador Isinger, who is the head of the Munich Security Conference, said that there was no American pressure, but it shows that there is a development from last year's conference where J.D. Vance, Vice President J.D. Vance, supported the inclusion of AfD as a main partner in a democratic role, let's put it like this, contrary to what former Chancellor Merkel has said in the past. Mm-hmm. And this is exactly what it is. And I hope and I will see that next year it will be the continuation of this year's decisions. Okay. So it's a process. It's not necessarily a definition by itself, but it's a process that starts to put certain lines within the time frame of what it is, basically.
Okay, Nuno, it's always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us on the program today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
We'll take a break now, and when we return, we'll take a look at the major stories from the region. Welcome back to A News. Now let's take a closer look at the key stories shaping the region. Head of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, Mohammad Eslami, said Tehran may consider diluting its 60% enriched uranium, provided that all sanctions are lifted, rejecting reports about transferring the highly enriched uranium to a third country.
In one of most direct indications of its position at talks with U.S., Iran's Vice President and nuclear chief Mohammad Eslami said Tehran could agree to dilute its highly enriched uranium in return for all nuclear-related sanctions being lifted. Speaking to reporters on Monday, he rejected transferring the stockpile of 60% enriched uranium to a third country, saying the issue was not on the agenda of the nuclear negotiations with U.S. held in Oman. Also, President Masoud Pezeshkian said at a meeting with foreign ambassadors that Iran is seeking win-win negotiations to guarantee its nuclear enrichment rights under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. He said that the new round of talks is an opportunity for a fair, equitable, and mutually acceptable resolution of the nuclear issue. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi on Monday held separate phone contacts with his Egyptian, Saudi, and Turkish counterparts, during which he briefed them on the indirect talks between Iran and U.S. in Muscat. In the latest development, Iran's Secretary of Supreme National Security Council, Ali Larijani, arrived in Oman on Tuesday for an official visit. The visit comes 4 days after Oman hosted the indirect Iran-U.S. nuclear negotiations on Friday. It also coincides with the visit of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to U.S., which will reportedly focus on the Iran-U.S. nuclear talks. Turaj Shiralilu, Tehran, for A News TV.
Turkey is stepping up diplomatic engagement amid persistent US-Iran tensions. Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan remains in contact with both Tehran and Washington, warning the region cannot afford another war. Ankara says military action would only escalate the crisis as US and Iranian officials resume talks in Oman. Our correspondent in Istanbul brings us more.
Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan on Monday spoke by phone with his Iranian counterpart Abbas Araghchi as diplomatic efforts continue in hopes of diffusing regional tensions. According to Turkish diplomatic sources, the foreign minister's call focused on the recent resumption of talks between Iran and the United States amid fears of further military escalations. In televised comments, Fidan warned that U.S. airstrikes on Iran would not lead to a change in government, but would rather push Tehran towards what he described as more radical decisions. Fidan said the Middle East could not withstand another war, calling on Washington and Tehran to resolve their differences through additional talks. He added that Turkey remained in close contact with both sides, maintaining communication with both U.S. and Iranian officials in hopes of seeing negotiations continue. Drawing on his previous role as Turkey's representative to the International Atomic Energy Agency, Fidan also addressed concerns over Iran's nuclear intentions. He said there was no data suggesting that Iran is currently building nuclear weapons and that Tehran appears to have no intention to start producing them. The foreign minister's remarks were echoed by Turkey's ruling AK party. Speaking to reporters, party spokesman Omar Çelik reiterated Turkey's opposition to a U.S. attack on Iran, saying such a scenario should not be considered under any circumstances. This is Adam Mara for A News in Istanbul, Turkey.
The United States is stepping up its role in the South Caucasus, backing energy cooperation and security ties with Armenia, while pushing for regional stability. Vice President J.D. Vance was in Yerevan, highlighting Armenia's growing strategic importance in Washington's plans for new trade and energy routes.
Armenia and the United States have signed an agreement to deepen cooperation in the civilian nuclear sector. That's according to US Vice President J.D. Vance on Monday. Vance spoke after talks and a signing ceremony with Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan in Yerevan. He said the deal includes major US exports, along with long-term fuel supply and maintenance support for Armenia's nuclear energy facilities.
We're also very proud to announce that our nations have completed negotiations on a 1-2-3 civil nuclear cooperation agreement. Now, once that is completely stood up, it'll pave the way for American and Armenian companies to strike deals on civil nuclear projects. That means up to $5 billion in initial U.S. exports, plus an additional $4 billion in long-term support through fuel and maintenance contracts.
The Vice President also announced a separate agreement under which the United States will sell military drone technology to Armenia, valued at $11 million. Vance's visit comes 6 months after Armenian and Azerbaijani leaders signed a US brokered agreement at the White House last August. That deal was seen as a key step toward ending decades of conflict between the two countries. J.D. Vance is the first US vice president to visit Armenia. His trip is focused on advancing the Trump route for international peace and prosperity, known as TRIP. After meetings in Yerevan, Vance is expected to travel to Baku on Tuesday. His visit to both countries aims to push forward a Washington-backed peace agreement in the strategic South Caucasus region.
Representatives of Azerbaijan civil society have addressed an open letter to US Vice President J.D. Vance. They're calling for support for the peaceful return of Western Azerbaijanis displaced from Armenia and the protection of their cultural and religious heritage.
Representatives of Azerbaijan's civil society have addressed an open letter to US Vice President J.D. Vance, outlining their position on religious tolerance, cultural heritage protection, and the right of return for Azerbaijanis displaced from Armenia. In the letter, they describe Azerbaijan as a country built on interfaith coexistence and religious tolerance, highlighting the protection and restoration of Christian heritage sites and the expansion of religious communities in the country. They also draw attention to the forced displacement of Western Azerbaijanis from Armenia since the late 1980s, citing the destruction of villages and religious sites. The authors stress that their demand is not territorial, but humanitarian, calling for the peaceful return of displaced Azerbaijanis to their ancestral lands and the restoration of cultural and religious heritage. They also urged US support for these efforts as part of a lasting regional peace. US Vice President J.D. Vance has begun a 3-day visit to Azerbaijan and Armenia. Vance arrived in Yerevan on Monday before proceeding to Baku on Tuesday.
A British engineering company is at the centre of a potential sanctions loophole, exporting high-tech machinery to a firm linked to Russia's military supply chain via Armenia. Experts warn this case highlights how Western technology can slip through indirect routes, fueling the war in Ukraine despite strict controls.
The UK government is facing pressure to review an export licence after concerns emerged that British technology could indirectly aid Russia's war in Ukraine. The Guardian reported that Signet Texkimp, a company based in Cheshire, has been approved to export advanced machinery worth more than £4 million to Rydena LLC, a newly formed company in Armenia. The equipment produces carbon fibre prepreg, a high-performance material used in civilian industries, but also critical to military systems such as drones, aircraft and missiles. The equipment is currently being assembled in the UK and could ship within weeks. The concern is Rydena's leadership. The company was set up in 2024 by former executives of Umatex, a Russian carbon fibre producer critical to Russia's military. Umatex is part of Rosatom, Russia's state nuclear corporation, and was sanctioned by the US in February 2023 and by the UK in May 2023. Rydena insists it works only in civilian sectors and has no Russian clients, but experts warn Armenia is a transit hub for Russian sanctions evasion. A news investigation, Shadow Trade, shows Armenian exports to Russia jump from $880 million pre-war to nearly $3 billion now, including phones, computers, machinery and microchips, components essential for Russia's weapons. Ukrainian forensic teams confirm these parts appear in missiles and drones. Sanctions experts say written end-user promises provide limited protection once technology leaves the UK. Signet says it followed all export rules and received government approval. The UK government has not commented on whether it checked Rydina's Umatex links. Liam Byrne, MP, chair of the House of Commons Business Committee, said there are red flags and questioned whether export controls are strong enough. The case highlights how Western technology continues to reach Russia indirectly, despite sanctions.
At the World Defence Show, Azerbaijan and the Slovak Republic have tightened their ties in the defence industry. Azerbaijan's Minister of Defence Industry, Vugar Mustafayev, and Deputy Prime Minister and Slovak Republic Minister of Defence, Robert Kalinak, signed a memorandum. This envisages the expansion of cooperation between the two countries in the field of the defence sector. Kazakhstan has unveiled plans for what it calls the first crypto city in Central Asia, as part of a broader effort to develop new digital and investment infrastructure. The project is set to be built in the newly established city of Alatau. Our correspondent reports from Almaty.
Kazakhstan plans to establish the first so-called crypto city in Central Asia, a designated zone for operations involving digital assets. The project is being developed with the participation of a Chinese construction company and forms part of a broader plan to build new urban infrastructure. The crypto city will be located in Alatau, a newly established city in southeastern Kazakhstan. It sits along the Almaty-Konaev highway and is linked to the Western Europe-Western China transport corridor. Authorities intend to use the area as an economic and logistics platform. The investment portfolio of Alatau city includes 44 projects with a total value of around $4 billion. They span industry, logistics, agri-processing, services and creative sectors. Among the planned developments are the multifunctional Iconic complex, intended as the city's business core, and the technology university focused on workforce training and applied research. A special legal framework is being prepared for the city. A draft constitutional law on the special status of Alatau is currently under review in Parliament. It provides for the creation of a free economic zone, visa-free access for foreign visitors, and unrestricted property purchases across an area of roughly 880 square kilometers. Digital assets are expected to be usable for payments within the designated zone. At the same time, regulators stress that the tenge will remain the country's only legal tender, with crypto payments processed through conversion into fiat currency. And according to the Minister of National Economy, if all planned projects are implemented, Alatau could generate up to $40 billion for the country over the next 30 years. Fariza Kalimurzana, Almaty, A News.
After the break, we'll explore US Vice President J.D. Vance's historic visit to Armenia and the significance of a new nuclear cooperation agreement with Washington. Stay with us. Welcome back to A News. US Vice President J.D. Vance has visited Armenia, marking the first time a sitting American Vice President has visited Yerevan. Washington and Yerevan have also signed a nuclear cooperation agreement, highlighting deeper strategic engagement in the South Caucasus. To discuss what both capitals hope to achieve and how it might affect regional dynamics, including peace efforts with Azerbaijan, let's bring in our guest, Ms. Parvana Valieva, member of Milli Majlis of Azerbaijan, joining us from Baku, Azerbaijan. Parvana, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, to begin with, let's begin with the symbolic impact, rather. What does it mean for US policy that J.D. Vance is the first sitting US Vice President to visit Armenia, and how does it reflect Washington's priorities?
Yes, the US President Vice President J.D. Vance started its visit to our region, to South Caucasus, and this visit is continuation of Washington brokered agreement signed between Azerbaijan and Armenia, witnessed by the U.S. President Donald Trump last year. And today's visit gives a clear message that U.S. remain closely engaged in our region, and that our region is included in the President Donald Trump's foreign policy priorities. Yesterday, J.D. Vance was in Armenia. It is expected next station for him will be Azerbaijan.
Okay, and staying on his visit to Armenia, the new nuclear cooperation agreement was announced. What are the real technical and strategic implications of this pact for Armenia and for US interests in the region?
Yeah, the agenda of the Vice President to Armenia was included several topics. One of them was nuclear cooperation between Armenia and the US. This is about civil nuclear energy cooperation. It is expected to have electricity from nuclear energy. And the second, it was military and security cooperation that Armenia is now intended plan to buy some drones from US technology, powered US technology. And the third one was the presentation of Trip Route project, and it was a very important topic because Trip Route is one of the main strategic elements of the peace between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And regarding visit to Azerbaijan, we have very good cooperation now with US because US-Azerbaijan relations have recently reached his peak and entered a new phase of strategic partnership after Washington Peace Summit last year. During the President Ilham Aliyev's visit to Washington, D.C., an agreement signed to launch a strategic working group for establishing a strategic partnership between two countries. And this strategic partnership includes covers three areas. Energy, regional connectivity, including trade and transit, is a part of a TRIP project, as well as economic investments, including AI, digital infrastructure, security cooperation, including defense sales and counterterrorism cooperation. Also, J.D. Vance visit to Armenia, it is also included, artificial intelligence, new technologies coming to our region. This is also for peace and the prosperity of the region's people.
Okay, and Parvana, Moscow historically viewed the South Caucasus as within its sphere of influence. How might Russia interpret this deepening US-Armenia alignment?
Now we closely cooperate with US because US here not only was a mediator but also stakeholder. We think that Azerbaijan and Armenia has a historic achievement, a historic agreement in these days, and it also should be welcomed by other countries, including neighboring countries, because it is for the prosperity and for the stability, regional stability. That's why, as Russia is also in our region, so I think these countries also should welcome and support this idea, these developments for the region that is long-awaited peace happening in the region. Vice President Vance gave also political messages during his visit to Armenia, stating that peace is not made by the people who fought on the past. Peace is made by the people who have has for the future. This statement is very good response to also Armenian diaspora and revanchists who still continue past narratives and raise revengeful ideas among the Armenian community, which is also harmful for the existing fragile peace negotiations. And the author of the peace agreement is the President Ilham Aliyev, who firstly initiated peace agenda right after the 44 days of patriotic war. Some countries wanted to mediator after patriotic war, but it is actually, in fact, U.S. That ended conflict between two countries and brings more prosperity and peace, stability for the region.
Okay, and lastly, Parvana, from a regional balance perspective, how might Iran, Turkey and other neighbours respond to bolstered US-Armenia ties, especially if linked to security issues?
Now, Azerbaijan is a very strategic country in the world that is a neighbor to Iran and Russia. And at the same time, now we see that south and north part of Azerbaijan is a sanctioned area. So in this case, Azerbaijan is the best way for transits, for trading, for investors, which is a very stable transit, and it is also supported by U.S. government. After U.S. brokered agreements, this confirmed U.S. role in the region. Also, U.S. President Donald Trump had some meetings in late September in Washington, D.C. with Central Asia countries. It shows again that U.S. President Donald Trump included his foreign policy priorities, our region, and I think, again, these countries also should welcome U.S. role and the recent developments, recent relations with U.S. as well as recent peace developments between Azerbaijan and Armenia.
Okay. Ms. Parvana Valieva, it was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your analysis today.
Thank you for having me.
That's the news for this hour. Stay tuned to A News for more updates, and thanks for watching.